It was the early morning of June 14th, 1842, deep in the humid expanse of the Carolina lowlands. Mist clung to the swamp edges like a heavy veil, and the plantation house loomed silently above the darkened fields. To any passerby, it was a place of ordinary work. The rhythmic sounds of hoes striking the soil, the low murmur of human labor, the occasional call of a livestock animal. But beneath the veneer of routine, a disruption was about to unfold, one that would confound the authorities and terrorize those who believed they had total control. At the center of the unfolding story were two enslaved women, both remarkable not for rebellion in the usual sense, but for their sheer audacity and cunning. Their names, whispered reluctantly in the quarters, were Sarah and Matilda. Sarah, a woman in her mid-20s, was known among the enslaved community for her quiet intelligence and attention to detail. She carried herself with a calm deliberation, observing more than speaking, memorizing the daily rhythms of the plantation as though cataloging the routines of every overseer and guard. Matilda, slightly older and larger in stature, was physically imposing, yet she possessed a surprising agility and a mind attuned to problem-solving. Together, they formed a partnership that had gone unnoticed beneath the surface of ordinary life. Their daily existence was marked by labor and restriction, but also by small acts of ingenuity. Sarah would quietly repair torn clothing, hide food scraps, and memorize the patterns of patrols. Matilda, often underestimated by those around her, was adept at lifting objects and creating diversions without attracting suspicion. This combination of mental acuity and physical presence would soon prove critical. The events began subtly. On the night of June 13th, a storm rolled in from the south, bringing wind and heavy rainfall that rattled the wooden shutters of the main house. Many of the guards were inside, seeking refuge from the storm, their attentiveness dulled by fatigue and complacency. Sarah and Matilda had spent weeks preparing for this moment, noting every guard shift change, the location of the horse stables, and the weak points in the perimeter fence. By 2 a.m., the rain had turned the dirt paths into slick mud. In near silence, the two women moved from the quarters to the edge of the plantation. Their progress was slow and careful, each step measured against the likelihood of discovery. No one saw them leave, no overseer, no fellow enslaved worker, no dog, which had been unusually quiet that night. The discovery would come later, but for now, the plantation remained undisturbed. It was only when the morning light began to filter through the fog that the absence of Sarah and Matilda was noted. A group of laborers arrived to begin their daily work, only to find the two women gone from their assigned areas. Initial reports assumed they had been taken elsewhere, perhaps called into the main house for chores. But when repeated searches yielded no trace, alarm began to spread. The overseer, a man named James Whitfield, personally conducted a thorough inspection of the grounds. The tool sheds, stables, and nearby swamp edges were combed, but each search concluded in frustration. Footprints led away from the plantation into the dense woods, but the rain had erased much of the trail. What remained were impressions too inconsistent to follow reliably, leaving even experienced trackers puzzled. Word of the disappearance traveled quickly. By noon, the plantation had organized a search party of 50 men, each armed and instructed to capture the women at any cost. They combed the forest, interrogated nearby laborers, and scoured the swampy outskirts for signs. Yet as evening fell, not a single clue could be definitively linked to Sarah or Matilda. The initial shock on the plantation gave way to anger, disbelief, and a growing fear that they had been outsmarted. If you appreciate detailed investigations like this, you're watching Grave Case Files. Subscribe and join us for more real case deep dives. By the second day, the bounty hunters had expanded their search radius. Reports of sightings were inconsistent and contradictory. Some claimed to have glimpsed two figures near the riverbank, others near the northern pastures. Despite the numbers and preparation, nothing concrete emerged. Witnesses who had initially been confident in identifying tracks now admitted that the mud, storm and shifting terrain made their accounts unreliable. The story that would follow over the coming weeks was not one of immediate capture or violent confrontation, but of a cat-and-mouse pursuit that tested the limits of human observation, endurance, and ingenuity. Sarah and Matilda, the two women who had lived under constant surveillance, had vanished into terrain that, to most, seemed impossible to navigate undetected. Yet every detail, from the subtle diversion of a guard's attention to the strategic use of natural cover, pointed to careful planning rather than random chance. By the third morning after their disappearance, the full scope of the situation had begun to take shape. 50 trained men, many armed with rifles and tracking dogs, scoured the surrounding swamplands and forests, moving methodically yet cautiously. Their leader, a man named Tobias Green, had experience in tracking escaped laborers and fugitives, yet even he expressed quiet frustration. Reports of footprints led to dead ends, muddy banks offered no reliable impressions, and the heavy storm had erased much of the subtle evidence that might have revealed the women's direction. Witnesses were questioned one by one. Elderly enslaved workers who had observed Sarah and Matilda for years described the women's habits in meticulous detail. Sarah's patience, they noted, was unparalleled. She rarely spoke unnecessarily, and her eyes seemed to note everything without drawing attention. Matilda, in contrast, was physically commanding but cautious, able to lift, carry, and manipulate objects in ways that often went unnoticed. Both were considered capable, intelligent, and deeply determined. Yet even with this knowledge, no one could predict how far or how cleverly they might evade capture. One of the earliest sightings came from a neighboring plantation, several miles north. A young boy reported seeing two large figures slipping between the trees at dusk. His description was vague. He could only recall the size and movement of the figures, but it was enough to mobilize a second wave of bounty hunters. Horses were readied, riverbanks were patrolled, and guards were stationed at common escape routes. Still, despite this escalation, the women remained elusive. Investigators began to piece together what evidence was available. The footprints near the river suggested careful planning. One set indicated someone deliberately carrying weight, perhaps supplies, while the other set suggested lighter, more agile movement. The spacing of the tracks implied that both women were moving in a coordinated manner, alternating pace to prevent leaving a continuous trail. Every detail indicated that they had anticipated pursuit, and that the terrain was being used deliberately to obscure their path. Rumors among the search party began to circulate. Some claimed that the women had vanished into the swamp entirely, using hidden paths known only to those familiar with the area. Others speculated that they might have had outside help, although no tangible evidence of collusion ever surfaced. The tension within the search teams grew, frustration mingled with fear, and minor conflicts emerged over which leads to prioritize. Despite the sheer manpower deployed, every strategy seemed to fail. By the fifth day, local law enforcement became involved. The sheriff sent additional men and requested mounted patrols, yet even with the increase in resources, Sarah and Matilda's trail remained invisible. Letters were sent to neighboring counties describing the escape, including detailed physical descriptions, clothing, and known skills. Yet no one could confirm the women's exact direction or intentions. The absence of violence was notable. Unlike many escapes that escalated into confrontation, Sarah and Matilda had left without injuring anyone, moving with calculated precision. Interviews with former acquaintances painted a clearer picture of their preparation. Months prior, Sarah and Matilda had observed patrol schedules, supply deliveries, and guard rotations. They had memorized the patterns of river currents and swamp depths, and even subtle shifts in weather that could aid or hinder pursuit. Small diversions, displaced tools, faintly altered trails, concealed food caches, were detected too late, leaving searchers second-guessing their strategies. Local legends began to emerge. Some spoke of two enormous women moving through the swamp like shadows, their presence inferred only by the slight disturbance of reeds and branches. Others told of glimpses of their figures on distant ridges, disappearing before anyone could close the distance. These accounts, often contradictory, added a layer of mystery to the already perplexing investigation. The authorities began to document the case meticulously, treating it as both a criminal pursuit and a study in human ingenuity. Evidence logs were compiled, detailing footprints, reported sightings, and environmental conditions. Contradictions were noted. A river sighting contradicted a hilltop sighting. Reports of heavy movement conflicted with accounts of quick, almost silent travel. These inconsistencies baffled even the most seasoned trackers. Meanwhile, life at the plantation grew tense. Guards became increasingly cautious, fearing further disruption. The overseer conducted nightly inspections, and the remaining enslaved workers were watched closely. Yet Sarah and Matilda had already demonstrated that foresight, patience, and subtlety could outmatch brute force. Each failed attempt at capture reinforced their reputation and instilled unease in both pursuers and those they left behind. By the second week, the case had taken on a strange duality. It was simultaneously a criminal investigation and a psychological puzzle. Authorities began developing multiple theories. One suggested that the women had hidden in nearby swampland until the search intensity diminished, then moved quietly toward distant counties. Another proposed that they had secured assistance, either from sympathetic outsiders or from fellow laborers familiar with the terrain. Yet no definitive proof supported either theory. Even more perplexing were the practical impossibilities of the escape. The terrain was dense, muddy, and heavily patrolled. For two women of considerable size to move rapidly, silently, and with coordination over multiple days defied conventional tracking expectations. Yet the evidence suggested that not only had they survived the initial days, but they had also managed to consistently evade the best-trained trackers of the region. It was during this period of mounting frustration that authorities expanded the search beyond immediate borders. They sent messages to adjacent counties, coordinating with sheriffs, deputies, and informants. Notices were posted describing the women in precise detail, their stature, physical build, clothing, and known behaviors. Yet despite all these measures, the trail remained broken, as though Sarah and Matilda had vanished entirely. And here the case becomes particularly intriguing. No violent confrontation, no errors, no immediate capture. Every attempt to close in on them failed. Every sighting was fleeting, inconsistent, or unverifiable. It became clear that what was occurring was not merely an escape. It was an exercise in foresight, patience, and mastery over environment and perception. The pursuit continued for months. The initial 50 bounty hunters remained committed, but their efforts were gradually reduced as frustration and practical concerns intervened. New hunters were hired in rotation, yet none succeeded. Reports continued to emerge, each more enigmatic than the last. Occasionally, distant farmers or laborers would claim to see the two women, but by the time authorities arrived, there was nothing but footprints, mud, or broken branches. Sarah and Matilda had created a living mystery, one that would confound local authorities, become the subject of whispered legends, and challenge every assumption about pursuit and human ingenuity. Their disappearance was no accident. It was the result of meticulous planning, detailed observation, and a relentless drive to achieve what seemed impossible. The weeks and months following the disappearance of Sarah and Matilda marked a profound shift in the atmosphere of the plantation and surrounding counties. The initial panic, anger, and disbelief gradually transformed into a tense, almost reverent caution. Overseers altered patrol routines, laborers whispered of the two women's intelligence and audacity, and bounty hunters, some of them seasoned veterans, spoke privately of a pursuit that had defied all reason. The failure to capture them left a void in authority, a recognition that conventional power could not always assert itself against strategy, patience, and ingenuity. Local communities began to recount the story in hushed tones. Among enslaved laborers, the narrative became one of careful admiration. two women, marginalized and oppressed, had outwitted an entire force of men, moving through swamps, rivers, and forests as though guided by an unseen hand. Among overseers and bounty hunters, the account carried a different weight: frustration, humiliation, and a lingering fear that the women were still nearby, observing, or even silently influencing the environment to their advantage. The folklore that emerged was subtle but persistent. In some villages, it was said that two women could appear anywhere at dawn, slipping silently across the mud and reeds, leaving only vague traces to tantalize those who tried to follow. In other accounts, Sarah and Matilda were described as figures who understood the land itself, reading the movement of water, the bending of reeds, the shift of animal tracks, and using it all to conceal their path. While these stories took on a mythic quality over time, investigators noted that each claim carried a kernel of practical truth. The women had relied on their intimate knowledge of terrain and weather, on patience and timing, and on creating misdirection to ensure their survival. From a psychological perspective, the impact on the hunters and authorities was significant. Tobias Green, the lead tracker, documented a rare admission that he had never before experienced a pursuit where anticipation, observation, and deliberate deception outweighed sheer manpower. 50 trained men, armed and methodical, had been unable to capture two individuals who relied solely on wit, agility, and intimate environmental knowledge. This realization undermined confidence in conventional methods and forced a recognition of the limits of human expectation. The official investigation eventually drew to a close, not with a sense of resolution but with acknowledgement of failure. Reports were filed, evidence was archived, and correspondence with neighboring counties ended. Yet the documentation of the case remained meticulous, serving as both record and study. Descriptions of terrain, weather patterns, human behavior, sightings, footprints, and indirect evidence were preserved. Historians would later note that the case offered rare insight into the capabilities of individuals operating under extreme constraint, and how intellect and planning could overcome brute force and organization. By the third week, the intensity of the search had begun to strain not only resources but the mental stability of those involved. Tobias Green and his 50-man contingent had spent countless hours in the swamps and forests, enduring rain, mud, insects, and exhaustion. The men, many of whom prided themselves on tracking skill, now faced a reality that defied all conventional logic. Two women had outmaneuvered them repeatedly, leaving only fragmented traces of their passage. The sheriff, once confident in the efficiency of law enforcement, began to express unease. Reports of footprints, broken branches, and fleeting shadows had become a daily ritual of frustration. Some deputies speculated aloud that the women were using natural camouflage techniques, moving through areas where visibility was minimal, relying on the swamp's dense vegetation to conceal their presence. Others whispered of methods so cunning that the women seemed almost like ghosts, leaving no predictable trail. A detailed review of the initial evidence revealed subtle patterns that had been overlooked. Footprints indicated alternating weight and pace, suggesting the two women coordinated their movement to minimize detection. Small diversions, such as scattering objects to mislead trackers, were evident upon close inspection. Logs recorded disturbed foliage in unnatural sequences, and faint traces of materials not native to the immediate area hinted that supplies had been prepositioned. Every detail pointed toward careful, methodical planning, executed with near-perfect precision. Witnesses from surrounding plantations were interviewed again. A young laborer recalled seeing two large figures crossing a shallow creek at dawn, moving with remarkable speed for their size. He noted that their clothing was damp but intact, and that neither appeared burdened, suggesting they had prepared waterproof coverings or methods to transport supplies without slowing their movement. Another witness described two shapes disappearing into a dense grove, leaving only the subtle sound of leaves and water. These accounts, though inconsistent, reinforced the notion that Sarah and Matilda had carefully selected routes and timing to exploit both natural cover and human oversight. As investigators dug deeper, contradictions in the searchers' reports became apparent. Some men claimed to have followed footprints for miles, only to lose them entirely in mud or swamp water. Others insisted they had glimpsed movement on elevated ridges, where the terrain made pursuit nearly impossible. These discrepancies created internal tension. Some searchers accused one another of negligence, while others feared the possibility that the women had external assistance. Yet despite repeated questioning, no accomplices were identified. In an attempt to understand the escape better, authorities examined the women's background. Sarah had grown up near the plantation, quietly observing patterns and behaviors without attracting attention. Matilda, known for her physical strength and spatial awareness, had displayed remarkable ingenuity in her tasks, often improvising solutions to complex problems. Combined, their skills created a synergy that made them extraordinarily difficult to anticipate. During the fourth week, the search area expanded dramatically. Horses and boats were deployed to cover rivers, creeks, and swamp channels. Additional manpower from neighboring counties joined the pursuit. Bounty hunters, trackers, and law enforcement officers moved in coordinated sweeps, yet the women's trail continued to elude them. In some areas, footprints would appear briefly, suggesting passage, only to vanish completely in marshy terrain. Investigators began theorizing that the women had identified natural features that allowed them to cross the landscape without leaving continuous traces, tree roots, hidden sandbars, or elevated mounds that temporarily bore weight. Confusion and frustration grew within the search parties. Some men began reporting strange phenomena, glimpses of figures in the fog that disappeared when approached, footprints leading to water that seemed impossible to traverse, and sounds of movement in dense thickets that could not be corroborated. These reports were logged carefully, yet they did little to advance the investigation. For the first time, the pursuit was no longer solely about recapture. It had become a psychological struggle between human cunning and the environment. Authorities began compiling multiple theories. One suggested that Sarah and Matilda had built temporary shelters in concealed locations, moving only at night or during periods of low visibility. Another proposed that they were using hidden routes known only to experienced laborers familiar with the swamplands. Yet another theory speculated that the women had deliberately manipulated evidence to confuse trackers. A tactic so sophisticated it suggested premeditation, extending months prior to their escape. Meanwhile, the plantation itself descended into tension and fear. Overseers increased patrols, questioning workers relentlessly, yet no one provided actionable information. Rumors spread among the enslaved community. Some believed the women had spirits or supernatural protection. Others credited sheer brilliance and planning. Even within the search parties, the more rational men began to admit privately that they had underestimated the women's intelligence and adaptability. By the sixth week, sightings became rarer but more dramatic. A farmer reported seeing two figures moving silently across a river bend at dawn, carrying objects that appeared to be provisions. The observer noted the figures' size and movement with unusual precision, and that they seemed to vanish almost instantly when the fog thickened. Another account described hearing voices in the distance, though investigators could not confirm if the sounds were human or echoes carried by swamp acoustics. The methods the women employed began to emerge through indirect evidence. They appeared to have moved in a zigzag pattern, avoiding predictable lines of pursuit. They used the environment, swamp waters, reeds, tree canopies, to mask their direction. Items left behind intentionally or accidentally were used to mislead pursuers. Broken branches, displaced logs, even faint footprints leading in circles. Every discovery reinforced the idea that their escape was a calculated strategy, rather than a flight of desperation. As weeks turned into months, the case grew legendary. Letters describing the women's disappearance were circulated far beyond the local counties. Authorities kept meticulous logs, comparing reports, documenting sightings, and analyzing terrain. Yet despite exhaustive efforts, Sarah and Matilda remained untraceable. Investigators grew increasingly perplexed, forced to confront a reality that challenged conventional tracking logic. Two human beings, ordinary in appearance yet extraordinary in intellect and planning, had outwitted an army of 50 trained men for weeks, perhaps months. It was during this prolonged investigation that the psychological dimension of the case became clear. Authorities realized that the women were not merely evading capture, they were controlling perception. By carefully choosing what evidence to leave and what to obscure, they had manipulated the hunters' expectations and tactics. The pursuit, once methodical and confident, had become tentative and reactive. Each failed attempt to corner them amplified the women's reputation and increased the mythos surrounding their escape. And so, by the time the 7th month approached, the mystery had solidified into an enduring legend. Sarah and Matilda had vanished into the swamp, leaving only fragments of evidence and a series of impossible sightings. The men who had pursued them remained haunted by the futility of their efforts, the strange impressions of footprints, the fleeting shapes glimpsed through fog, and the eerie sense that their quarry was always one step ahead. As the 8th month approached, the investigation had transformed from a frantic manhunt into a careful study of ingenuity, patience, and the limits of human perception. By now, Tobias Green and his remaining trackers had endured weeks of relentless searching, combing the lowlands, forests, and swamplands, yet each lead ended in frustration. The initial hope of a swift capture had long dissipated, replaced by a grudging admiration and unease for the women who had so thoroughly eluded them. Authorities began to reconsider the environment itself as an active participant in the women's escape. Swamps, rivers, dense forests, and hidden thickets were no longer just obstacles. They were tools that had been exploited with precision. Investigators noted that Sarah and Matilda appeared to understand water currents, ground stability, and the movement patterns of local wildlife. Every subtle shift in mud, every concealed route through brush or over fallen logs, seemed calculated to obscure pursuit. Where one hunter saw a dead end, the women had seen a hidden pathway. Where another saw a continuous trail, it had been deliberately disrupted. Detailed interviews with trackers revealed the psychological toll of the hunt. Men who had once been confident described moments of near paranoia, reporting shadows moving in the fog that could not have been human. Others admitted to questioning their own observations, noting that the women seemed to anticipate every tactical maneuver. One tracker, a veteran of several similar pursuits, confessed privately that he had never before encountered a case in which two human beings had so thoroughly manipulated perception, terrain, and expectation. By this point, formal investigations extended to neighboring counties. Notices were posted, letters sent, and rumors circulated, but verifiable information remained elusive. The pattern of sightings, sparse, fleeting, contradictory, continued to confound authorities. A farmer near the northern river recalled seeing two figures at dawn, moving with surprising speed across a muddy bank. Their clothing, heavy and damp, appeared to cling unnaturally to their forms, suggesting preparation for the difficult terrain. Within hours, a search party arrived, only to find the bank undisturbed and no trace of the women. Examination of these sightings produced an unusual conclusion. The women had mastered the art of misdirection. Items such as broken branches, partial footprints, or displaced vegetation were left strategically, creating false trails. Observers' attention was drawn to these signs, yet the true path remained hidden. It was an exercise in foresight and patience, indicating that the escape had been meticulously planned for months, if not years. Authorities began compiling comprehensive maps of the women's probable routes. The maps highlighted natural cover, shallow waterways, elevated mounds, and dense vegetation, all potential advantages for those familiar with the terrain. Cross-referencing the sightings and footprints with these maps, Investigators noted that the women had likely relied on short, deliberate movements rather than extended runs, avoiding detection by breaking the pursuit into manageable segments. Every element suggested extraordinary intelligence, discipline, and determination. Despite these insights, the trail continued to break unpredictably. At times, reports of sightings were months apart, sometimes in locations separated by miles of difficult terrain. In some cases, hunters believed the women had doubled back, erasing evidence of their passage. Theories emerged suggesting that the two women had established temporary shelters, moving only under the cover of darkness or poor visibility. Some trackers speculated that they had even carried food and supplies concealed within natural formation, such as hollow trees or reeds, allowing them to survive in isolation for extended periods. One theory, widely discussed among the remaining trackers, suggested that Sarah and Matilda had become almost entirely nocturnal in their movements. By exploiting the darkness, fog, and swamp acoustics, they could travel without leaving continuous traces. It was noted that the women's size, often cited as a potential hindrance, was, paradoxically, an advantage. The weight of their footsteps left inconsistent impressions, confusing trackers accustomed to following more uniform prints. As months turned into a year, the intensity of the search declined. 50 initial bounty hunters had long been replaced or retired, new men taking their place only to encounter the same confounding results. Reports continued sporadically, sightings of large figures moving silently, fleeting glimpses at dawn or dusk, and footprints that ended abruptly in areas without apparent exit. Yet the women themselves were never captured, never seen in full view by multiple independent witnesses, never directly confronted. By the second year, the case had achieved a near-legendary status among local law enforcement and the broader community. The plantation where it began remained tense. The shadow of the escape lingered in the minds of overseers and laborers alike. Stories circulated in whispers, of two women moving with ghost-like precision, vanishing into swamps and forests as though guided by instinct rather than human ability. Investigators documented every account with clinical rigor, noting inconsistencies, but also acknowledging the extraordinary pattern of evasion. Even as the pursuit faded from active search operations, the investigation did not cease entirely. Authorities continued to receive sporadic reports of sightings and footprints, and every new tip was logged, cross-referenced, and analyzed. Yet the conclusions were always the same. Sarah and Matilda had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the lingering question of how two women could so thoroughly outwit 50 trained men. The final theories ranged from practical to improbable. Some investigators suggested that the women had integrated into communities far beyond the plantation, taking on new identities and lives that would ensure anonymity. Others entertained the possibility that the women had discovered hidden routes through the swamp, perhaps even natural caves or hollowed tree formations, allowing them to survive undetected for months. In every account, one detail remained consistent. The escape was not a product of luck, but of deliberate, extraordinary planning and execution. To this day, the story remains unresolved. No definitive evidence of Sarah or Matilda's ultimate fate has ever been documented. Yet the case stands as a testament to human ingenuity under extreme constraint, a reminder that even in circumstances designed to control and dominate, the combination of intellect, observation, and careful strategy can produce outcomes once thought impossible. The record of this pursuit, meticulously kept by authorities, bounty hunters, and witnesses, remains a compelling study in determination, resourcefulness, and the limits of conventional investigation. 50 trained men, months of organized searches, and every conventional tracking method proved insufficient. Sarah and Matilda had disappeared into history, leaving a trail of questions, faint traces, and an enduring legend. Despite the lack of physical resolution, the legacy of Sarah and Matilda endured. The legend influenced both contemporary and future understandings of escape, evasion, and resistance. Their disappearance became a study in subtlety and patience, showing that control imposed by others could be circumvented without direct confrontation. They had demonstrated in the starkest terms that careful observation, timing, and strategy could render conventional pursuit ineffective. The case also shaped the cultural memory of the region. Songs, stories, and whispered tales referenced two women moving like shadows through swamps and forests, vanishing where no one expected. Among those who had lived through the events, there remained a quiet reverence for their cunning, a recognition that the impossible had been achieved. The story was passed down, with details shifting but the core truth remaining. Sarah and Matilda had executed a disappearance that confounded authorities, eluded 50 trained hunters, and became a lasting example of human ingenuity in extreme circumstances. In the end, no final confrontation occurred, no dramatic capture was recorded, and no trace of Sarah or Matilda was ever conclusively found. The women's fates, their lives after the escape, and the routes they took remained a mystery. What survived was the record of pursuit, the fragmented evidence of movement, and the lessons it offered to those who study human behavior under duress. Even today, the case is cited in historical studies, criminal investigations, and folklore analyses. It is referenced not for violence or tragedy, but for the remarkable skill, preparation, and mental acuity displayed by two individuals facing impossible odds. Investigators and historians alike continue to marvel at the combination of subtle planning, environmental mastery, and human determination that allowed Sarah and Matilda to vanish from one of the most intensively patrolled plantations of the era. In conclusion, the story of Sarah and Matilda remains unresolved, yet it is preserved in meticulous records and enduring legend. It serves as both a cautionary tale for those who rely solely on force and a testament to the power of strategy, patience, and ingenuity. Their disappearance illustrates that even under extreme constraint, individuals can achieve outcomes that defy expectation, leaving behind a mystery that challenges understanding and inspires wonder. The files are closed, the evidence archived, and yet in the swamps and forests of the Carolina lowlands, the faint traces remain: footprints, broken reeds, whispers of movement, and the enduring reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only studied and remembered. Years passed, and the Carolina lowlands slowly returned to their ordinary rhythms. The plantation where Sarah and Matilda had lived remained a working estate, the daily sounds of labor and livestock continuing without interruption. Yet, the memory of the escape lingered like an invisible shadow. Overseers, bounty hunters, and laborers all carried the story with them, sometimes whispered, sometimes recounted with awe, but always with the unspoken acknowledgement that the impossible had been achieved. No further evidence ever emerged. Letters and reports filed with authorities faded into archives. Searches by law enforcement became infrequent, each new claim investigated with skepticism and caution. Historians would later examine these files, noting the meticulous documentation of footprints, environmental conditions, and sightings. Every analysis concluded the same thing: two individuals, acting with intelligence, patience, and deliberate strategy, had successfully removed themselves from the reach of organized pursuit. Speculation about the women's fate persisted. Some believed they had integrated into distant communities, adopting new identities and continuing their lives anonymously. Others theorized that they had found permanent refuge in the swamps, forests, or river systems that had aided their initial escape. There were even whispered stories of the women guiding others to freedom, though no verifiable proof ever supported such claims. Regardless of their ultimate destination, Sarah and Matilda had become legends in life as well as in story, symbols of resilience, cunning, and the audacity to defy overwhelming odds. For those who had hunted them, the case left lasting impressions. Trackers and bounty hunters, once confident in their skills, admitted privately that the pursuit had humbled them. Even the most experienced men acknowledged that they had been outwitted in ways they could not fully understand. The disappearance of Sarah and Matilda remained a study in patience, foresight, and mastery of the natural environment, demonstrating the extraordinary results that can emerge from careful planning and the refusal to be confined by circumstance. Today, the story is preserved not only in historical records, but in folklore, teaching moments, and academic studies. It serves as a reminder that control and power are never absolute. The escape of Sarah and Matilda illustrates that intelligence, observation, and strategy can achieve outcomes beyond expectation, leaving mysteries that endure long after the initial events have passed. No conclusion is possible regarding their ultimate fate. No resolution came in the form of capture, confrontation, or discovery. What remains is a careful chronicle of pursuit, observation, and extraordinary human ingenuity. Sarah and Matilda's story is preserved in the documents, the reports, and the lingering sense of wonder it inspires. A case file closed in official terms, yet open forever in curiosity and speculation. The plantation returned to normal. The hunters dispersed and life continued. But the swamps, forests, and riverbanks held their secret. Invisible to all who sought them, Sarah and Matilda had vanished, leaving behind only traces of movement, a catalog of careful planning, and a legend that would endure for generations. Some mysteries are never solved. Some disappearances leave no answers, only questions. And in the case of Sarah and Matilda, the impossible became reality, recorded meticulously, studied endlessly, and remembered always. The files are closed, the evidence remains, the women are gone.